I spent my retirement savings buying my daughter a house, but the night she locked me out on that porch while her in-laws sipped white wine inside and pretended they didn't see me changed everything. My name is Clara, and I am 64 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to, I had always been the one who fixed things. Not just leaky faucets and stubborn lawnmowers, but the small, invisible repairs families expect someone to make. After my husband died, I sold the little Cape Cod we'd shared, cashed in a modest IRA, and told myself I was buying more than a house for my daughter Rachel. I was buying her security. I signed every check with a smile, while the mortgage documents were drawn up with my name first, because she just had the baby, because her hours at the clinic were brutal, because that was what mothers did. When friends warned me about emptying my nest egg, I said, "She'll pay me back in dinners and grandbabies," and I meant it. It wasn't just the money. I painted her kitchen the night before her moving truck arrived, dropped off store-bought casseroles for new neighbor meet and greets, and babysat on nights when Rachel and Michael worked double shifts. I drove 3 hours to hold their colicky son so she could nap. I returned half of her calls, but always answered the ones that mattered, the I can't get to the sitter calls, the my car won't start calls. When their dog got out on a snowy morning, it was me who climbed the fence and brought him home. Quietly, I signed documents with the realtor that put the property in their names with one odd clause I insisted on. A written agreement about access and caregiving responsibilities that protected me in case the arrangement ever became abusive. The lawyer called it unusual but prudent. I called it someone hedging her bets. Small slights accumulated like dust on a windowsill. Rachel stopped inviting me to the holiday photos once Michael's mother, Claire Whitman, made a point of arriving with matching scarves and a look that said I didn't belong in the picture. At family dinners, I learned to make myself small, stirring the gravy, refilling the bread basket, laughing softly at jokes that landed somewhere above my head. Once, at a fundraiser they hosted for Michael's firm, I stayed on the couch and watched guests in shimmering dresses greet each other. Later, Rachel texted that Claire had said, "Your mother should have gone home. Her coat wasn't right for the room." The text landed like a stone. Mostly, I swallowed the barbs. I figured love was patient. I figured my patience aged me gracefully. When Michael started asking for help with expenses, "We're short this month. Can you cover the HOA?" I covered it. When Rachel said, "We need a new furnace," I signed another check and told myself the heat was a mother's work. Sometimes, when I sat up at night polishing another casserole dish, I found the contract I'd made with my attorney folded in the drawer. It was the only place I had put a line in the sand that I could see, the only reminder that I had not given everything up without thought. 3 months before the porch incident, I drove down during a storm to clear their driveway after Rachel texted she couldn't make it home from the hospital. Michael waved me off with a work excuse. He had a meeting. And then, when I arrived soggy and tired, he glanced at me as if I were an inconvenience. "You should be at home resting," he said, handing me a towel with the mechanical politeness of someone who hadn't seen a mother in years. I left without making a scene. Later that week, Claire sent a hostess gift with a note that read, "So glad you didn't stay for dinner," and Rachel liked the picture on Instagram without comment. Those micro-betrayals taught me how easily love could be treated like a monthly expense. That winter, the snow came early and hard. I drove over before the storm because Rachel had texted, "Can you stay the night? Michael's parents are coming from out of town." I did not imagine how specifically humiliating that night would be. I cooked, I set the table, I wore the chunky sweater Rachel liked. They toasted in crystal, and I sat at the head of the table while Claire gave me a measured smile that contained no warmth. I watched the in-laws glide through the room as if I were only scenery. When the second course came, Rachel's phone buzzed. She checked it, looked at Michael, then at me, and the way she looked said something I had not expected. Embarrassment. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, Claire had decided she'd had enough. "We'll be fine upstairs," she loud enough for me to hear as she nudged her husband Henry away from the living room armchair I had warmed for him. Michael moved toward the door with the efficiency of someone habitually practiced in exclusion. Rachel stood and said, "Mom, please, it's late. Why don't you just go home?" The words tumbled out like a script she'd been rehearsing, practical, final, and gently cruel. I didn't argue. I folded my hands, told them it was all right, and put on my coat. Snow was now a blunt white curtain at the windows. When I reached the porch, the door closed behind me with a sound that felt louder than thunder. I knocked once, then twice. No one opened. Through the glass, I watched them laugh at something in the living room where the chandelier threw diamonds on Claire's earrings. Rachel caught my eye through the pane, looked away, and mouthed, "I can't be seen." I stood on that porch in a wind that bit at my cheeks and watched my daughter pretend that my presence was a stain she could wipe away. I didn't scream. I didn't pound on the door. I felt my chest tighten the way it does when you swallow a cold pill, clean and clinical. A neighbor across the street hollered, "You okay, Clara?" And I waved, because people shouldn't be made uncomfortable by the breakdown of family. I walked to the car, drove to the little hotel off Route 12 where the clerk knew my name, and ordered a hot tea. My hands trembled as I watched the steam rise. No one from inside called. I sat under a lamp in a threadbare lobby and did the thing my younger self never would have believed. I took out my phone and dialed Gwen Alvarez, the attorney who had written that cautious clause into the purchase agreement. When Gwen answered, I said simply, "They locked me out." There was a pause, a measured sound that told me she had been waiting legally for this possibility. "Do you still have the original deed and the caregiving addendum?" she asked. I did. Gwen told me not to go back that night. She told me to let the cold be an ally and the law be a mirror. "There are remedies, Clara," she said, "but you must be precise." I watched the headlights cross the parking lot like a small film strip and felt the first trace of clarity like an underlined sentence. 2 days later, Rachel called, voice high and brittle. "I'm sorry, Mom. We didn't mean," she started, but Michael cut her off on the speaker with a clipped arrogance I'd heard before. "We're trying to establish our household, Clara. This is awkward. You hurt my father's reputation." Claire's voice hovered like perfume in the background. "Your mother should learn boundaries," she said. The line clicked and they were gone. That was when I felt the last stitch of my old assumption give. Love did not mean being available to be stepped on. It meant being willing to step away when dignity was the price. That evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of a hotel heater, I did the thing I had refused to do for years. I opened the original deed, found the clause Gwen had drafted, and read it aloud to myself. It was plain and not at all theatrical. A reversion clause that allowed the grantor to reclaim title in defined circumstances, including denial of agreed caregiving and access. It had been written because I had been pragmatic, not because I had imagined I would ever use it. Now its language felt like a tool I had been given and had finally learned how to hold. Rachel called again the next day, but when I texted back that I was consulting Gwen, the texts slowed. They became sparse and polite, perfunctory as holiday cards. Michael stopped returning my calls. The mortgage payment they'd been making was auto-pull from an account I'd once overseen. So was the HOA fee. I made a list, not of things I had lost, but of obligations I had quietly accepted. Automatic transfers, co-signed cards, utility autopays. For the first time since selling my old house, I asked myself who was responsible for whom. The answer came with a cold logic. If I continued underwriting their life, nothing would change. If I stopped, consequences would have to be natural. I went home for one last time to gather a few things my daughter's household had kept. The house felt very big without the small allegations that usually filled it. No laughter, no arguing, just the slow whir of a refrigerator working overtime. I walked through rooms that had been mine in every way but title, touching the banister I'd polished, the blanket I'd embroidered. Old photographs lined the mantel, a wedding grin, a child's crooked tooth, a summer picnic when the world felt uncomplicated. I sat with those images until something inside went quiet and sharpened. The grief opened and then reconsolidated into a different substance: resolve. Back at my apartment, I called Gwen and asked her to do 3 things. First, record the written notice of reversion and file it as a formal claim against the title. Second, place a lis pendens with the county records so the title would be publicly marked and any attempt to use the house as collateral would trigger a red flag. Third, draft a letter rescinding any informal permissions I had given for the automatic withdrawals tied to my accounts, effective immediately. I signed the forms with a steady hand. The decision was not theatrical. I did not shout or slap papers on a table. I sat at my kitchen counter with a mug that had a chip at the rim and signed the documents one by one. When Gwen told me she would freeze any sale until the claim was litigated, I felt an unexpected relief, like someone opening a window after a long, stuffy night. I also stopped the autopay for their extra grocery account, the one I'd kept because Rachel said, "It's only for the baby," and the quick little lie of that phrase had always calmed me. The bank notified me of the stoppage, asked a few bureaucratic questions which I answered with the same precision I had used to sign the deed years before. I packed a small bag, 2 sweaters, a photograph in a dented frame, the wedding napkin I'd kept, and left the house key in the top drawer. I did not take the grandchild's stuffed rabbit. I reasoned that possessions do not heal what neglect took. Outside, the world smelled of rain and wet leaves. I did not look back at the porch. The image I chose to hold on to was simple. The porch light left on, its glow fading into dusk, and me turning the corner to a different street. That night I slept at a friend's house instead of their home. When the first notice of the list pendants hit the county clerk's office, I watched the ripple unfold through the social membrane of my town. It began with a neutral email from a title company asking for clarification, then a terse voicemail from a mortgage underwriter looking for signatures. I read every message soberly. None of it felt like triumph. It felt like accountability, slow and inevitable as tidewater drawing back. Before the week was out, I received a call from a woman named Lila, who coordinated events at the Whitman estate. Her voice was all polished concern. "Is there any way we can settle this privately?" she asked, and when I asked who she was calling on behalf of, she stammered the way a hand misses a handshake. "Social reputation matters, Clara." I listened without telling her that social reputation is exactly what was being measured now. The way people chose who they would protect when cruelty showed its face. I canceled the utilities I had kept in my name and arranged for my mailbox to be forwarded. The quiet consequence of those small cancellations was mechanical and immediate. A letter from the utility company requesting payment, a notification to a lender about a missed auto pay, the beginning of a paper trail none of them could charm away. My hand did not shake as I mailed the formal notice to Rachel. I knew their lawyer would receive it, and that alone would begin a chain reaction. At the end of the week, I walked to a park bench and opened an envelope from Gwen containing a simple notarized confirmation. The lis pendens was recorded. The house, legally, could not be transferred or encumbered without addressing my claim. I folded the paper and let sunlight make squares on the page. The end of my old life felt less like a dramatic swing and more like a door softly closing behind me. The first sign that I had not imagined a consequence came as a text from someone I barely knew, an architect who had been consulting with Michael on a basement remodel. "Sorry to bother you, Clara, but we were about to press forward on permits. The title company flagged an issue." I watched the dominoes falling from my kitchen table like grain in a slow hourglass. At the same time, an email from a local real estate attorney reached every contact in the Whitman social circle. A neutrally worded notice that the property had a legal claim against it, and any prospective buyers would be advised to consult counsel. Word traveled fast. The town we lived in liked certainty. Michael's immediate panic played out in the kind of practical ways entitlement rarely practices. He called the lender who had extended him a line of credit using the house as collateral. The lender, faced with a recorded claim, pulled the line. Suppliers called, asking for immediate invoices. A contractor refused to start work. Michael texted Rachel in all caps. She texted back, a string of apologies and threats to Gwendolyn, the name of the new baby's future nanny, which somehow sounded like a lifeline none of them could grab. Within 24 hours, Claire called me through a blocked number. She sounded small. "This cannot be happening," she said. "We can fix this, Clara. We'll pay you back whatever you want." I let the silence sit between us like a ledger. She offered money as if it were an apology. I told her that money wasn't the point. There was a pause so long I could hear the weather. Finally, she said, "Please, honey, we'll speak to our lawyer." She meant save me, but she'd already been saving herself from me for years. The social fracture widened. Invitations meant to mask family faults were rescinded as neighbors, sensing scandal, took conceptual steps away. The country club that had been grooming the Whitmans for a leadership position sent a formal letter deferring consideration. A woman who had been lined up to be the Whitmans' charity co-chair sent a private message that read, "This kind of behavior won't reflect well on the organization. Within a week, the story, pruned by gossip, flavored by sympathy and social calculation, had a life of its own. People began calling Rachel at work. The clinic where she worked sent a polite note about professional conduct and boundaries that read more like a warning than a reprimand. An unexpected twist came when the building Michael had been using as collateral for a small business loan was reevaluated. The partner who had co-signed called to say he had been blindsided by the title issue and that his own credit was at risk. He sent an email to several mutual contacts, imploring them to step aside from the Whitmans until things settled. It wasn't just that the house was frozen. Every obligation that had used that house as leverage became suspect. Suppliers closed accounts. The renovation loan Michael had taken was accelerated. The Whitmans found themselves facing a pragmatic enemy they could not charm away: paperwork. They did not call me only to beg. They called to try persuasion, then to threaten legal action, and finally, when those tactics didn't restore the simple mechanics of their life, to plead. Every call landed on my answering machine, and I listened without anger. One message stood out: Rachel's voice, trembling in a way that suggested she had been awake all night and finally could not hold her breath any longer. "Mom, please, we need you. We're sorry. We'll do anything." The tinny recording made my hands cold. I replayed it twice and let it sit in the drawer with the Lis Pendon's confirmation. The town's reaction was the last unintended consequence. People who had liked the Whitmans for what they reflected, wealth, polish, a certain curated kindness, began to see what their hospitality had hidden. Neighbors traded their versions of events across fences and over Sunday coffees. Some offered muted sympathy, others unvarnished anger. A column in the local paper, neutral, investigative, asked why a woman who had given so much had been rendered homeless on a porch in a storm. The Whitmans found that their social capital had a price tag, and the people who had once insulated them were now insisting on accounting. Within a month, the house was under an interim stewardship order. Gwen had moved to secure the title and put in motion an estate audit. That audit turned up something else, a line item Michael had neglected to reveal to Claire, an unsecured loan taken against future tax credits for which he was personally liable. Creditors circulated documentation. I watched all of this with a kind of exhausted recognition. The natural consequences I'd hoped for were not sudden fireworks. They were accounting entries, phone calls, canceled checks, and the slow, terrible narrowing of options. I did not dance when the sheriff's office served the first civil notice of asset seizure, targeted at items tied to the business that relied on the house as collateral. I made tea. I folded laundry. Watching the life I had once untied from my own bank account begin to unravel without me participating felt oddly clean. There was no gloating in the way I watched them pack their fine linens into boxes that now felt too small for their embattled pride. There was simply the watching and the sensation of a chapter closing with the sound of paper sliding into envelopes. They came back to the phone then, in the way people return to a smoke alarm only after they have burned something. Rachel called morning and night. Michael tried once to come to my apartment bearing roses and an offer to sign repayment. Claire sent a courier with a stack of business cards and a check written with hands I no longer recognized. "Come have dinner," Claire texted. "We can talk." I read every plea, every apology, and for the first few days, I file-logged them, saving each message like a specimen. Then I stopped saving their calls and began saving something else: time. I had a trip planned months earlier, a simple plane ticket to see my sister in Oregon. Gwen told me she could tie up the remaining loose ends remotely and that my legal claim was secure enough for the moment that my absence wouldn't undo it. I sold the house, quietly, through a trustee arrangement Gwen set, and with the proceeds bought a small condo near the coast. I did not broadcast where I was going. I sent a card to Rachel with a forwarding address that directed all future contact through Gwen. When their daily pleas arrived, Gwen forwarded a single line. "Clara is not available to discuss reconciliation at this time." The first morning in my new place, I walked out onto a porch that faced the ocean. There is no social pretense when the horizon is simply a strip of blue. I brewed coffee with a pot I'd never once owned in a marriage house and sat at a small table with nothing on it but a napkin and the paper. My hands were steady. I watered a plant I'd carried in a travel bag. Its leaves were not perfect, but they leaned toward the light. I knew now that healing does not arrive in proclamations. It comes in the ordinary gestures that say, "I am still here." They begged on the phone. They wrote letters. They tried the public route of charm and then the private route of money. I met them with a calm so absolute it was almost boring. I answered once on a Sunday to Rachel's voice, and instead of delivering an address or a promise, I said, "I hope you find a way to treat people that doesn't cost them everything." She cried. I hung up. That was my revenge, not a spectacle, but a refusal to resume paying for a life they had chosen. Weeks later, a mutual friend told me that the Whitmans had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment with a landlord who required higher deposits and a guarantor. They called me daily, but their messages drifted in like late weather reports, smaller, keener, often asking for something I no longer had to give. Once, early one gray morning, I found a voicemail from Michael that said, "We messed up." I listened to it twice and then deleted it. Deleting it was like letting a letter fall from a tree. It landed and was gone. Healing threaded through small, stubborn things. I learned the bus lines and began walking to the market. I joined a Thursday knitting circle where no one's title entered the conversation. I planted lavender in a narrow strip in front of my new windows and stood out there with my coffee, watching bees do the ordinary work of pollination. If revenge is a drama, mine was an afterthought. It was the quiet rearrangement of life toward dignity. One afternoon, while tearing open a package of seeds, I realized I'd stopped checking for their messages. That silence was not cruelty. It was a boundary that protected the margin of a life I had not thought would still be mine at 64. I called Gwen and we reviewed the final settlement documents. The house sold, the title cleared for transfer in trust, and the Whitmans' claims extinguished. They were, by legal and social measure, on the other side of a door they had once thought they could close forever. I drink my coffee on a porch that faces an indifferent ocean. Sometimes the phone rings, and I let it go to voicemail. The messages are there, and so is the absence I chose with both hands. The last image I carry from that winter porch is not of frost on the step or the sting of an open door. It is of myself crossing a threshold into quiet. An ordinary woman who learned that setting limits can be the softest kind of armor. I plant a row of lavender each spring and watch it return season after season. It does not shout, it simply blooms.